Welcome to Debate. Today, we are diving into something pretty significant, a tension that feels both sociological and economic. It's about Gen Z's transition into, well, full adulthood. Specifically, we're looking at their ability, or maybe the perceived inability, to handle the demands of the modern workplace and, frankly, just basic adult responsibilities.
It really is a critical issue. I mean, the reports are widespread, aren't they? We keep hearing about these struggles, this intense dependency, and a really crippling level of anxiety in this generation as they try to engage with adult life.
Absolutely. So the central question we need to wrestle with is this. Is the difficulty Gen Z is facing, managing money, showing up professionally, coping with challenges, is this primarily down to some kind of inherent generational problem, like an incapacity, maybe deep psychological shifts? Or is it fundamentally the result of external systemic failures, systems that have basically set them up for a precarious life?
And those are two really fundamentally different ways of looking at the exact same data, the same behaviors we're seeing.
Precisely. And my position is that the evidence strongly suggests we're looking at a generation exhibiting really unprecedented levels of dependency and profound psychological barriers, too. It looks like a crisis of incapacity that makes navigating work and personal life extremely difficult, sort of independent of the broader economy.
Okay, well, I come at it from a different angle. While I absolutely acknowledge the behavioral symptoms, they're hard to ignore, I really contend that the root cause here is overwhelmingly structural. This generation, I believe, has been systematically failed. They've been let down by predatory educational systems, by lending systems that saddle them with just crippling debt and anxiety. That forces dependency, maybe not as a choice, but as a kind of logical, if destructive, coping mechanism against this structural vulnerability they face.
Okay, let's dig into the evidence that points towards, well, a full-blown generational crisis, one defined by these deficits in skill and psychological stability. The data around workplace interactions is, frankly, it's staggering. Take parental involvement. Surveys have found that, get this, 53% of Gen Z respondents said a parent had actually spoken with a hiring manager for them during an interview process.
Wow, 53%.
Yeah. And it doesn't stop there. Even after getting the job, 45% report regularly having a parent talk to their current manager.
Those figures are certainly alarming. Yeah. They indicate a level of parental scaffolding, maybe? But we do have to look at the context those behaviors are happening in.
Well, the context, unfortunately, I think only deepens this crisis of incapacity I'm outlining. Because the most shocking figure for me is that 73%, nearly three-quarters, admitted having parents help complete their actual work assignments. This isn't just giving advice or, a ride to the interview. This is active, deeply inappropriate intervention in basic adult professional duties. And I think this behavioral crisis connects to a documented psychological shift. Key personality traits we know are linked to workplace success, like conscientiousness, being organized, reliable, and agreeableness, which affects how you handle feedback. Those have plummeted for this generation. At the same time, neuroticism, the trait linked to anxiety, worry, emotional instability, that's skyrocketed. This data suggests Gen Z is almost psychologically wired against the resilience needed for professional life.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. Because while those statistics, they are undeniable symptoms, I don't think they're the disease itself. The root cause, I believe, lies outside any inherent failings of these young people. They were, as I said, systemically failed. They were, frankly, set up to fail by institutions they were taught they had to trust.
And which institution do you see as the main driver of that failure?
The primary culprit has to be the exploitive system of higher education and student loans. It basically functions like a scam, leaving Gen Z potentially thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt before they even step foot in their first real job. Universities, they acted predatorily. They exploited easy government financing to just jack up tuition prices exponentially. A key mechanism here is the availability of federal plus loans. These are essentially limitless, government-backed loans, mainly for graduate school, and because the government guarantees these funds, regardless of the student's future earning potential or, frankly, the quality of the degree itself, Universities face zero pressure to keep prices tied to reality or market demand.
So the fact that these loans are available almost automatically, it removes any incentive for colleges to actually be accountable for the financial outcomes of their students. Is that right?
Exactly, right. This mechanism allowed tuition to just balloon. Even for degrees with very low earning potential. Maybe a very niche humanities master's degree, for instance. These carry crushing debt, but offer no realistic path to paying it back through employment. So that financial crippling and the pervasive anxiety it naturally generates, those are the true drivers of the struggle we're seeing. Young adults were basically told college was the only path to success. They followed that advice, took on the debt, and now they're left structurally vulnerable. Their reliance on family support, those shocking statistics you mentioned, maybe it's less a failure of maturity and more a kind of defense mechanism against an impossible financial situation they didn't create.
I see the logic there, and I absolutely agree the debt mechanism is deeply flawed. But let's go back to the parental involvement data for a second. If the cause is simply structural desperation, why does it manifest in such a profound failure of basic adult competency? I mean, I would argue that 53% of parents talking to hiring managers, 45% talking to current managers, that demonstrates an unacceptable lack of professionalism, of basic communication skills. It kind of confirms the perception you hear from managers that Gen Z can be, frankly, impossible to work with. This isn't just about structural precarity. It feels like a failure to perform basic expected adult interactions.
But you're sort of disconnecting the behavior from the context that makes that specific job so existentially crucial. When society effectively mandates high-cost, high-debt education for any chance at success, the financial stakes of getting and keeping any job become impossibly high, right? When a young person enters the workforce already drowning in loans they took out because they were essentially misled into believing it was the only option, that job isn't just income, it's the only immediate way to avoid potential financial ruin. So parental intervention, yeah, it's inappropriate by traditional workplace standards, absolutely. But maybe it becomes a kind of desperate scaffolding. It reflects the parent's own understanding, perhaps, of the existential financial trap their kid is in.
Okay, but let's test that premise, though. If it were purely a function of debt and financial pressure, why aren't we seeing millennials who also dealt with the 2008 recession and, let's be honest, significant student debt? Why aren't they displaying this same level of profound parental dependency in the workplace? The debt existed then, to a degree, but this specific behavior, it didn't seem to. Doesn't that point back towards an inherent generational shift in psychology or capability?
That's a fair point, but I think the scale and the nature of the debt have shifted pretty dramatically, especially for some of these non-professional degrees, largely because of those plus loan mechanisms we talked about. That's led to, I think, an unprecedented level of precarity for many. And furthermore, the cultural expectations around parenting have changed too, haven't they? Millennials might have had debt, sure, but they generally didn't experience the same level of intensive snowplow parenting, maybe, or the same pervasive culture of risk avoidance throughout their upbringing that Gen Z arguably did. So the financial pressure today might simply be finding a pre-existing channel of dependency to flow through, one that wasn't quite as pronounced before.
Okay. I can concede that parenting culture is definitely a relevant variable here. But the psychological wiring, for me, remains the biggest barrier. Let's look again at that data showing the, frankly, terrifying inverse relationship. As time spent online has surged, key traits like conscientiousness have plummeted, while neuroticism, anxiety, worry, fear has skyrocketed. That lack of conscientiousness translates directly, I think, into an inability to meet deadlines, to complete assignments independently, which kind of explains that shocking 73% figure of parents helping with work. Gen Z seems demonstrably psychologically wired for anxiety, making it incredibly difficult for them to cope with just normal professional pressures.
Well, while social media is undeniably a factor, I wouldn't dispute that, affecting attention spans and maybe psychological fragility, I'd challenge making it the primary cause. I really believe the overwhelming dread, the inability to cope that we're seeing, comes much more significantly from the sheer scale of the student loan crisis. The predatory lending practices just handing out limitless loans for degrees with marginal, sometimes negligible earning power, that feels like the core issue, creating this pervasive sense of impending doom and anxiety.
So you believe the anxiety is almost entirely a result of that financial dread, and the psychological traits are sort of secondary or consequences of that.
The financial dread is the overwhelming catalyst. That's why I believe structural reform is what will ultimately mitigate the psychological fallout. We need to force accountability onto universities. Regulatory proposals like maybe capping the amount of federally guaranteed debt for certain types of degrees, that could compel universities to actually operate within a framework of supply and demand again. It could lower tuition, put the focus back on providing education that's either vocational or demonstrably leads to viable careers. That kind of structural accountability, I think, not just individual coping strategies, is what will truly lessen the financial burden that's generating so much distress.
I do acknowledge the debt crisis is real and needs addressing, but the crisis as it manifests today feels deeply psychological and behavioral, and it's profoundly exacerbated by technology. I mean, social media addiction seems to create a fragmented attention span, an inability to tolerate even minor setbacks or frustration, which is almost the definition of low resilience, right? And furthermore, the university environment itself often seems to reinforce this fragility, sometimes prioritizing emotional comfort over the kind of necessary hardening required for the adult world. The result seems to be students who are incredibly emotionally fraught, anxiety-ridden over perhaps abstract political issues, instead of being prepared to navigate concrete real-world challenges like managing a budget or resolving workplace conflict.
They're kind of paralyzed by systems that demanded their compliance, demanded massive financial investment, yet often delivered few usable skills, and, in many cases, a guaranteed financial liability. So to what extent is the psychological fragility we observe actually a rational, maybe even defensive withdrawal from a system that has proven itself to be fundamentally exploitive? Social media might just be the most easily available coping mechanism for the deep isolation and stress that this precarity causes.
Look, while I agree Gen Z was dealt a very specific set of cards, including this exploitive debt system, individual responsibility, I think, remains paramount. To overcome the observable psychological barriers and skills deficits today, the generation really has to focus on personal agency. They need to somehow move past the narratives of victimhood, intentionally build those real life skills, communication, conflict resolution, meeting deadlines, and maybe embrace the uncomfortable truth that no one, not even their parents, can or really should save them from their own professional obligations.
But demanding individuals just bootstrap the way out of this completely ignores the systemic mechanism that pushed them into this financial hole in the first place. They were following the exact high-cost path society told them they had to follow. You can't just ask a generation to grit their teeth and succeed when they're potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, while the institutions that created that debt keep operating without consequence, ready to trap the next group. Unless we enforce real accountability on the universities, maybe by ending these government-backed, limitless student loans for certain degrees, the problems of tuition bloat, meaningless credentials, and crippling debt are just going to persist for future generations. It's not just about individual effort. The system itself has to be fixed.
I absolutely agree we need systemic reforms. We have to hold universities accountable and cure that root financial illness. However, the consequences of that past failure manifest today as undeniable deficits in readiness and skill. We can't simply rationalize away parents intervening in job interviews or, worse, doing their children's work as just a rational response. Gen Z, right now, has to focus on immediate, personal action to overcome their psychological wiring and chronic anxiety while that slow process of institutional reform hopefully takes place. They simply can't wait for systemic change to become capable adults.
And I have to maintain that the inability to handle adulthood that we're observing is often, perhaps tragically, a natural and necessary response to being financially crippled by what amounts to a fraudulent system. They're struggling because they were victims of an exploitive arrangement where colleges cashed the tuition checks, regardless of whether the student ended up truly capable or employable. So we fundamentally disagree, it seems, on whether the behavior we see is primarily a rational, albeit undesirable, response to that crushing debt, or if it's evidence of a deeper, inherent psychological shift within the generation itself.
It is clear, though, that this is incredibly complex. The interplay between psychological well-being, the influence of technology, and this devastating financial structure, it all requires sustained critical analysis. We have to keep focusing on how these forces are shaping the core abilities and the challenges of this generation as they move into their prime working years.
Agreed. Understanding both the structural forces that shape opportunity and the psychological mechanisms that mediate how people respond to those forces is essential if we want to improve outcomes, not just for Gen Z, but for future generations too. And there's certainly much more to explore within this material, particularly regarding the specific institutional failures that have really defined the modern student experience.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.